Continuing from last segment where we discussed this really rare phenomena in 1905, you get a revolution in a country that is about 1 to 2% maximum politically participant. That liberal government lasted for about 5 years, and it was overthrown not by the Iranians, but by the British and the Russian. This, I am suggesting to you, is a pattern you will see over and again as we discuss various countries in the Middle East. The overthrow of liberal democratic powers, democratic governments by the Western powers. And so therefore, keep in mind this pattern is very, very important. It's a recurring pattern. It's happening at a very critical period in the political history of these countries. It's the very early phase of transition to mass politics. Now, going back to Iran, to that overthrow of that revolution, out of this experience that Iranians had with liberal democracy and then seeing their government in effect overthrown by the British and the Russian, out of this experience, a myth began to take hold among the Iranians. And that myth was that the United States is a wonderful and very nice country that likes liberal leaders and the third world. So what was the source of that mythology? What happened? What did the Americans do that led to this thinking? Well, the source of that mythology is really resides almost in a single American by the name of Morgan Schuster, I shall discuss later on. But as you will see that he played a crucial role in trying to have liberal democracy succeed in Iran, establish order, and he was forced out of Iran by the British and particularly by the Russian. The mythology and the infatuation with the United States last almost for a half a century until the United States overthrows Dr. Mossadegh in 1953. This brings me to phase 2 of Iran's journey toward mass politics. So, to repeat, the first phase was political participation at the level of 1 to 2%. That was the 1905 revolution. This was followed in 1905 as Iran begins to make its journey toward mass politics. By 1925, I would place politically participant Iranians at about 5% of the population. And this led to the coup d'etat by Reza Shah, the father of the last king of Iran, in 1925, and he establishes the Pahlavi dynasty in Iran. He's an authoritarian modernizer, if you recall from our discussion of the elite alteration, elite change, and he speeds up the process of change in Iran. But then he's forced to abdicate during World War II by the British. And the next phase, the 10% phase, is the time in which the United States and the British ended up overthrowing the government of Dr. Mohammad Mossadegh in 1953. At that time, political participation was around 10%. From 1953, you have a royal dictatorship in Iran, and the line of political participation really begins to shift pretty rapidly until it reaches what we call the mass political level, and that was in 1979 when you have a revolution in Iran. And throughout this period, our support for the Shah of Iran was critical, and Shah's policies and changing world really helped accelerate the pace of change. After 1979 revolution, we are still back playing with the internal politics of Iran. To give you some example, right after the revolution, under Reagan administration in 1980s, we had the Iran Gate. It was an attempt by the United States to help the more moderate elements in the Iranian government to dominate, and in the process to get some money to illegally use it to fund the Contras in Nicaragua who were fighting the government. In 1990, Newt Gingrich, the then Speaker of the House, earmarked $20 million for covert operation to bring about regime change in Iran. And a lot of Iranians felt insulted because $20 million is not going to get you much, let alone to overturn a regime. And even in 2006, we had our Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice, asking for $75 million to bring about regime change in Iran. The point of it is that the 1953, when we were able to overthrow Iranian regime, the political participation rate was about 10%. We can't get away with that anymore when the political participation rate is 80%, when Iran is a mass political society. So today, really, Iran is an authoritarian mass political polity, and yet the theme of foreign intervention that I mentioned in the context of Iran are not by any means unique to Iran. They too are a pattern that are repeated throughout the history of the Middle East, as a lot of the Middle East was colonized. And in many ways, we do have a hard time keeping our hands off Iran and countries that are we consider strategically important. What I want to show you is a graph that depicts the pace of political participation in Iran. So when you look at this, you will see that beginning in 1900, when you have the revolution in 1905, you're looking at 1 to 2% rate of political participation, and then it really begins to peak out in the beginning in 1960s onward, and you notice that there is a very rapid acceleration of change under the Shah, culminating by 1979 in the Iranian Revolution. So this hopefully will show you how suddenly the pace of change accelerated as Iran began to modernize, and as also a function of the passage of time. Now, in a period, therefore, when you think about it, of less than a generation, in a period of 25 years, Iran went from about a 10% politically participant to total participation. Now, I want to be careful to notice, or at least to call your attention to the fact that when I say these people are politically participant, I'm not by any means suggesting that they are sophisticated people. Actually, these people are newly participant. They tend to personalize politics. They tend to look to their leaders for values and for guidance. But that is still a big change. Compare them to their parents who were not at all politically participant. All right, the second use of the pyramid, as I mentioned, relates to capturing the political elites and their interaction, so to speak. So I want to begin with that, Iran's political elites, and the period I've chosen is a very exciting period. It's a period in which the second liberal democratic government in Iran, the first being the 1905 revolution, the second period being the 1952-53 period. And if you look at the pyramid in terms of politically participant, What I'm going to do is to look at the 10% politically participant, because in 1952-53, that was the size of the population that would be considered politically aware, politically participant. Again, remember, to become mass politics, that line has to go all the way down to 1980. And then what I want to do is to look at the very top 1%. And the top 1% are really the people that are the highly attentive people, if you recall from the previous segment. And what I want to do further is to blow up that part of it so that you can see the inside of it a little bit better. So what I'm going to do in the next slides is to blow up this 10% portion, highlighting the 1% and the 10%, so we can see how the elites, which way they're aligned themselves. So this is my first blow up. At the 1% versus the 10%. The A's are traditional anti-change elites. So really I'm looking at the elites of Iran, and the top 1% are the most important one. B is the liberal pro-change group, and C are also pro-change, but these people are authoritarian modernizers. If you look at this picture, you will see that the B's are the largest group in that top 1%. So when you look at that top 1%, the B's are the largest group, followed by A's, the traditional anti-change, and a smaller group are the C's. So if I was to make a pie chart of that top 1%, this is how it would look. You will see that overwhelmingly the elites are in the liberal, democratic, and I should add secular part, even though they had some religious allies in there. But by and large, they're liberal Democrats at the very top 1%. The traditional elites, the anti-change elites, are this next largest, and then the authoritarian modernizers, most of them are leftist, communist, socialist, are in the third group. Now if I go to the next slice from that initial slide, in other words, look at the top 10% instead of the top 1%, you will see that the share of liberal Democrats has shrunk, while that of traditional elites has increased. So as soon as you go down below the 1% line, you begin to see the weight of the traditional group still being heavy. And then to really appreciate how different the rest of the country would look like is to look at the remaining 90%. That's that 90% that I didn't even map on the first triangle, on the first pyramid. The remaining 90%, they're all politically non-participant, and they are anti-change. There is not one liberal really in that category. You have a sliver of authoritarian modernizers because they reflect the workers who had, these are lower class workers, blue collar workers, who identified with the Communist Party. So that little red sliver that you see refers to them. So there is nobody in the B category, in the liberal democratic category, below that 10% line. So if you decide to call for a free election, and let's say that voting would be compulsory, who would you say would win the election for the whole country? Well, the answer, I'm sure, it shouldn't be difficult for you. The traditional group are going to win because they're the largest. Look at the 90%. They're all traditional. And 10% is not going to do it for you. Now, suppose you make literacy tests a requirement for voting. Then you can also answer the question, who's going to win? You will see that the liberals will run away with the election. Because at that time, a large swath of Iran were illiterate. And you can see that this is very, very important. When Western leaders call for free election, keep in mind what kind of a society you're confronting, what kind of a society free election is being exercised. Let me give you an example. During the Algerian Revolution in the late 1950s, when political participation was about 5%, the French consistently wanted free election because they knew the traditional element who would cooperate with them will win. So that's why they wanted free election. Let me give you a more recent example. After the collapse of the former Soviet Union, Albania, which was by far the least politically participant, the most backward country in Europe, Albania in 1991 had an election, and remember, this is the most backward country in Europe, and the country had 60% rural population. They held a free election. The communists, who are now anti-change because they wanted to go back to status quo ante, because the communists, after the collapse of Soviet Union, they were now the traditional element. The Democrats wanted change. The Democrats won the cities, but the communists won the election because 60% were rural. So even though you had a situation in which you had a collapse of the Soviet Union, because of the rural and backward nature of Albania in terms of political participation, if you had a free election, the communists would come right back to power. You will see the same phenomena in the Middle East. Throughout the late 60s and early 70s, Israel wanted free election in the West Bank, in the Gaza, because again, the political participation picture was such that the conservative, the collaborators, the notables would win those elections, and Israel felt they could deal with them much better than they could deal with pro-change, who wanted freedom, who wanted to have independence, and who wanted to end the occupation. Now, question. We have three groups: A's, the traditional anti-change; B's, the people that are closest in value and thinking to us, liberal Democrats; and C, the authoritarian modernizer. Of the three groups, which one did we as Americans support it? Well, you know the answer. The answer is that we consistently supported A's and we undermined the B's. And that hopefully will plant an idea in your head that when we keep doing this kind of a behavior, when we insist on this type of a policy, there are going to be blowbacks that's going to come and haunt us. And one of the keys to the rise of Islamic resurgence, Islamic fundamentalism in these countries, has to do with the way we really paved the way for their growth.